Earlier this week, a talk by the gender-critical philosopher Dr. Kathleen Stock was interrupted by trans activists. And amongst those protesters was Riz Posnett, who silently glued their hand to the floor. And Riz joins us now. Very good afternoon from us.
Hiya, thanks for having me on.
How are you and how's your hand?
I'm well-ish. My hand is completely fine. Overwhelmed. I'm currently hiding out at a friend's place because I've had reporters following me a little bit, but I'm well. And like I said, thanks for having me.
Okay, our pleasure. Let's have a proper conversation about all of this, Riz, and let's start with the obvious place. For someone who doesn't agree with your stand for trans rights, what would you hope that they thought when they saw you protesting?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I think my answer would be, well, my hope with the protest was just to ensure that anyone who heard Kathleen's views, who heard her speak, just had the opportunity or was encouraged to think about the consequences of that sort of speech and that attitude towards trans people, for trans people, and particularly for trans kids. That was my hope in all of this.
So Kathleen Stock has said many times that she doesn't think that she is transphobic, but what she's trying to do is maintain her position, which is shared by many, many people, a belief in biological sex at birth. And what she would hope to do in her lifetime and in her work is to allow a better conversation to be had about how you protect the most vulnerable in society, which may be some trans people, it may be some women, it may be some men, it could be people of all ages. So what would be your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like it's intuitive that yeah, it's absolutely scientific that people are born with genitalia that almost always fits into one of two categories. However, when people emphasize biological sex over and over and over, that's a really clear and resounding dog whistle. As far as I'm concerned, Kathleen is absolutely the academic and palatable front for this very insidious, very hateful movement. And you can absolutely see that through how all of her fans, how everyone who supported her has acted and how they've talked about trans people in the aftermath of this. I feel very strongly about protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. That's exactly what I was trying to do. And I do believe that there is some nuanced conversation to be had about how do we make sure women are safe from men as predators, right? That is a serious conversation we need to have. But we can't have that in a way that threatens the safety of trans people. That's not justice. And that's not, in my view, what feminism should ever be about.
Do you have some examples in your own life that can tell us more and our listeners more about how it feels to be trans and to have your safety put at risk because of that?
Yeah, I mean, the most striking one, I think, for me is immediately after Kathleen's talk was announced, there was total uproar and people picking sides and all of that. And the LGBTQ Society in Oxford University came out and organized Trans Pride for the same day. This was meant to be Pride, right? A celebration of joy and of resistance, but really a peaceful protest and just a moment to remind the trans people in our community how loved they are and how important they are. Now, Kathleen replied to that tweet announcing that with absolute babies, a bit arsey, but fine. And then the organizer received a death threat immediately afterwards in their post in response to this event that was a peaceful and, in my view, uncontroversial protest. Yeah. I mean, I've been called every slur under the sun in the last 36 hours. And I'm resilient, and I'm also in a place where I'm relatively protected. I'm accepted at my university and by my family, but there are so many more vulnerable trans people who are far less secure than me. And threats like this and dialogue like this truly endangers them.
So how do you and how do we take away some of the heat of that debate that is making those vulnerable people, and particularly young vulnerable people, feel less safe in our world? Because people could equally say of you, Riz, that you are turning up the heat on the debate by your protests and by, as you've said, this need at the moment to feel that we are taking sides.
Yeah, I do appreciate that as a point. And turning up the heat was something I wanted to avoid doing, right? I didn't expect this much outrage at a relatively peaceful and undisruptive protest. Kathleen could have continued talking, chose not to, and then continued.
Yes, but you could not have glued your hand to the floor.
In my view, that was a non-negotiable action on my point, purely because I think her views are really dangerous, and the union didn't invite any actual trans people to explain why that was dangerous.
Okay,
I
so
felt it
that's
was
such a good point, Riz. Can you explain a bit more to us? You don't have to use personal experience, but of what you know from other people, because sometimes with this debate now, we end up talking so much, just as you and I have done over the last couple of minutes, about who's right and who's wrong and who's taken a side and who's done this. And actually, what we really need to understand and hear more of is how trans people feel, why they feel unsafe, not because of demonstrations like yours, not because of debates in the media, but what makes a trans person feel unsafe at the moment, because there's an enormous amount of attention and some really dedicated people trying to understand the issue for them.
Yeah. I think so. There are so many examples. Trans people are harassed in their workplaces, prevented from accessing housing. They're harassed online constantly in the streets. I think I understand your point, right, about not wanting to emphasize the rhetoric and narrative, but I think the point here is that is at the center of this. When it becomes mainstream and acceptable to talk about trans people in the way that Kathleen and many other gender critical or TERFs or whatever, the way that they do, you normalize it, and then it's more common that trans people get more serious, more violent threats on the street. That's not illogical. That's how these things occur.
Your placard had the phrase "No more dead trans kids" on it. Am I correct?
T-shirt, but yeah.
T-shirt, yep. Is it fair to say that the deaths of children at their own hands would ever be solely down to one thing in their life?
So I find it difficult to when people talk about suicide as like action you take against yourself. In my view, we should be striving to create a society where no one has to resort to that action. And as far as I'm concerned, it's unsurprising that trans youth in particular feel unsafe, feel unwelcomed, are bullied in schools constantly, and resort to self-harm, and at times resort to suicide. I think that's really unsurprising, considering how we talk about and talk to trans people. And even if those kids aren't experiencing it because they're not out and they're not portraying themselves as trans, they see that kids are aware of what goes on in the world. So I don't like to think about that as a child's decision. I don't think a child should ever be able to rationally make that decision, but rather we should be protecting them. You know, what I really have to say at the center of this to all of the people who've harassed me online, to Piers Morgan, to Kathleen Stock, to Billboard Chris, the notorious Canadian transphobe, I don't want to turn your kids trans. I'm not interested in that. I just want to ensure your trans kids, those are the kids that are trans, are safe and are protected and feel loved and feel like they have a right to exist as their true selves.
Yeah. Is it not worth them being able to hear Dr. Stock's argument, though, which, when taken from her own personal experience, is just very clear that at a time when she wasn't certain how she felt about her own body and about the changes that she felt were going on in her head, if she had lived at this time, in her teenage years were at this time, she might have gone down a path that she then couldn't reverse, when in fact, when she was a little bit older, she realised it was about her sexuality, not about her gender. And that is a lived experience, and everybody has to respect someone who has that story, don't they?
Yeah, I understand that experience, but the implications that she draws from it are based on like totally misleading ideas. The reality is, we're not handing out drugs to kids in the streets like candy. That's not happening. Most trans people have to wait like up to 10 years to access gender affirming healthcare on the NHS. It's simply not happening. I think we should be giving children spaces to explore who they are and to feel safe in their identities, whether that's as gay, lesbian, whether that's as trans, or whether that's as straight. Like, no matter what, kids should feel protected and safe. I'm absolutely on board with that. But the answer is not preventing kids from transitioning when that's potentially life-saving for them.
And if you were listening to this afternoon as the parent of child, your own child, who was really just trying to come to terms with who they are, trying to understand the adult world, trying to understand this conversation that you and I are having now, what would you say to reassure them? Because you can equally understand that all the noise that's going on at the moment would be frightening and not reassuring.
Yeah. What I would want to say is there are people who love you no matter who you are and no matter what you identify as. Um, Trans kids are consistently forced to be brave, right? Many people who support me have said, "You are so brave for what you've done." I hate attention. I didn't want to do this. I did it because I felt it was necessary. And I guess my dream is that we live in a world where trans kids don't have to be brave and they can just get on with their lives and have fun playing in fields like all other kids.
Riz, thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank
That's
you.
Riz Posnett, who had glued their hand to the floor of the Oxford Union during that debate attended by Kathleen Stock.